welcome to the International Water Resources Association Groundwater Task Force webinar on groundwater success stories, the importance of groundwater success stories. So we're keeping things very positive today, and we're going to have a panel that includes Nino Kukurić, Director of UNESCO International Groundwater Resources Assessment Center in the Netherlands, Susan Kalini, the Water Quality Management Specialist and Trainer in Jordan, Gert-Jan Nijjem, Senior Advisor for Delris Institute for Applied Research on Water in the Netherlands, and moderated by Anita Milman, a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the United States. So, as you might know, this is a webinar hosted by the International Water Resources Association. The IWRA is an international network of researchers and practitioners, everyone who works on a multidisciplinary range of water resource issues. And we're a nonprofit, non-governmental educational organization, and we're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, so we've been around for quite a while. We provide a global knowledge-based forum for bridging disciplines and geographies by connecting professionals, students, individuals, corporations, and institutions, everyone who's really concerned with the sustainable use of the world's water resources. So we're really happy to have you here today, all over 150 of you now, and we have a really great panel of practitioners and researchers, people who've been active in the field for many years. So as you know, this is the first IWRA Groundwater Task Force webinar, and it's going to be focused on the positive success stories. So I know a lot of times groundwater is not only a success of over expectation or depletion or negative impacts, and there are many locations where groundwater is managed successfully and problems are solved with mastery. So success comes in many forms, ranging from small steps or changes that set the stage up for future gains to larger transformations within the groundwater system. So these successes may result in improved management, governance, or physical outcomes. And we're going to look at a couple of case studies here today, and then we're going to be talking about just the overall impact and value of these positive success stories and what we can learn from them and kind of how we can apply the different contexts. So just to kind of briefly explain the format of today's webinar, to start, each of our panelists will give a short presentation, and at the end, we'll have time for questions from the audience. So if you have a question you'd like to ask either a single panelist or a group, please go ahead and send it in. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen there. So just go ahead and type in your question, and our panelists will either address all the questions at the end, or if possible, during the event, they might have a chance to give you a quick answer right away. So we're going to save the questions to the end. We're going to do all the presentations. It should take about an hour, and then about the last 30 minutes to 45 minutes should be for your questions. So additionally, if you see any points that you'd like to make, or just anything else, we can go ahead and put it in the chat box. You can see the chat there at the bottom. So go ahead and feel free to introduce yourselves to everyone else that's here today, and you can kind of converse about the webinar and about what you hear today. So, of course, we understand that we might not be able to get to every question with so many people here today, but you can always feel free to reach out to our panelists and engage with them that way. So. With that in mind, I'd like to turn the floor over to our moderator, Anita Milman. You're on mute.
Great, thank you. Greetings and welcome. I'm glad all of you are able to join us on Zoom. I have the great pleasure today of launching IWRA Groundwater Task Force's webinar series on groundwater success stories. Yes, you've seen the announcement and you've heard me correctly, success stories. Now, I know many of you thinking, a webinar series on groundwater that is not all doom and gloom, how can that be? While it is true that around the globe, the challenges related to groundwater are numerous and in many instances quite foreboding, there are myriad examples in which people have made strides in improving knowledge in preventing or reversing degradation and towards groundwater sustainability. These examples of where things are going well or progress is occurring tend to receive less attention than problem spots. Part of this is due to desire to put the spotlight on areas in which degradation is occurring so as to spark action. And in part, it's because when things are going reasonably well or headed in a positive direction, we as humans just tend not to take notice. Perhaps we just have too much else going on, or maybe it's just human nature. But there are important reasons for drawing attention to where progress is made. Water issues involve a complex intertwining of physical, social, and ecological processes, and disentangling this complexity to identify points of leverage can be overwhelming. But if we don't recognize where steps are being taken that lead to positive directions, we risk overlooking potential solutions. Further, we may become disillusioned and lose the will to act. So our goal as part of the Groundwater Task Force over the next 8 months or so is to remedy this by presenting you with a number of success stories. The success stories we're going to be telling are more than a congratulatory pat on the back. This is not an overly optimistic attempt to make us feel good about something. Rather, there's still much to be done in the world of groundwater. The stories we're going to be telling, though, have an important role to play in that process because they can help bring about change outside the immediate location where success has occurred. Success stories serve to generate awareness and help people envision future possibilities. They also provide evidence and thus increase credibility. Real-world examples demonstrate that progress is in fact possible. And as such, success stories provide motivation. They create a compelling narrative. They move us past inertia and they drive us to action. Lastly, success stories provide guidance. And through them, we can learn, generate new ideas, and grow. So in order to share success stories with you, we first had to define what success means. The dictionary definition of success is to attain a desired objective or end, or to turn out well. When we think about this with respect to groundwater, first thought might be to narrowly define success as a groundwater system that is fully managed sustainably with balanced use, protected from water quality degradation, and supporting a thriving human and ecological system. But success exists even in the absence of such an idealized state. Successes take many forms. These can be small steps to overcome barriers and facilitate future action, or they can be broader achievements that have wide-reaching effects. Thus, for our purposes, we define success quite broadly to include examples of actions that serve to halt degradation, even if they haven't reversed it, or adoption and implementation of new policies that are aimed at improvements, or perhaps development of new knowledge, or an effort that serves to overcome a barrier to management or to generate knowledge, etc. So I want to point out that success does not mean that everything is perfect. Water is complex, and we can have success in some aspects while still remaining at an impasse in others. Further, the world is constantly changing, so we need ongoing successes to keep us on track. And this, of course, points to all the more reason for recognizing successes when they occur, learning from them, and using them to help generate the next successes that are needed. So for today, we're going to focus on two examples of successes, both of where things are at the moment going relatively well. One is from the Netherlands and the other from Jordan. But subsequent webinars in the series are going to focus on different types of successes. So throughout the remainder of the year, you can expect to see sessions on successful policy and management interventions, success in quantifying, measuring, or evaluating sustainability, success in community-based management, success in examples of science driving policy, etc. So clearly, there are a good number of successes that merit recognition, many of which are not widely known. And many of you on this call today engage in groundwater as part of your work. So we want this conversation to be multi-directional. We'd love to hear from you about examples of successes you've encountered in your work, and we encourage your participation in this endeavor. So you're always invited to contact the Groundwater Task Force at any time. We're currently seeking people to both participate in this webinar series as well as interested parties to help prepare a groundwater outreach game and some other activities. So please do contact me if you're interested in that. In addition, we've created this input form, the survey I've just put in the chat, that asks for your input with ideas of success stories that you think should be heard and broadcast around the world. So please do take this moment to fill it out, either during the webinar or afterwards. So with that preface, let's get started with today's agenda. As many of you may be familiar with groundwater than others, more familiar than others, we're going to begin with a brief overview of groundwater, just to make sure all of us are on the same page. So Dr. Kukurić, the director of IWRA, the International Groundwater Resources Assessment Center of UNESCO, is going to kick us off with a short primer on groundwater. Dr. Kukurić is a hydrogeologist with about 30 years of experience working as a field hydrogeologist, consultant, scientific researcher, and project manager. After that, we're going to turn to engineer Susan Kilani, who's going to tell us about efforts to restore the Azraq Oasis in Jordan. Kilani is a Jordanian water quality management specialist with extensive experience in the field of water and sanitation in Jordan and the surrounding region. She's also currently a regional trainer for many emerging topics in water management, including risk management throughout the water supply chain, efforts related to the Sustainable Development Goals, ISO accreditation, and total water quality management. Following that, we'll transport ourselves a few thousand miles to the Netherlands, where Geert-Jan Nijsten is going to talk to us about the history of successes there. Nijsten is a senior advisor for groundwater for Deltares Institute for Applied Water Research on Water in the Subsurface. And prior to working at Deltares, Nijsten worked at IWRA and also as a policy advisor and program manager for a regional government in the Netherlands. As each of our speakers has a wealth of knowledge to share, we're going to leave plenty of time for Q&A. Throughout, you're welcome to post questions, as Scott explained, in the Q&A panel or in the chat. And since it's insightful for us to consider these cases and examples in light of one another, we're going to hold the verbal or vocal Q&A session for all the panelists jointly once you've had a chance to hear from them all. So with that as our introduction, I have the great pleasure to turn the screen over to you, to Dr. Kukurić.
Thank you, Anita, and good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone from IWRA headquarters in the Netherlands. 15 degrees here. We are enjoying summer. I'm going to, as announced, say a few words about groundwater in general. And since you might have different background and not be very much familiar with groundwater, we will start with a short animation of 2 minutes on groundwater, and I would ask Scott of Anita to start it. Thank you.
As our second primal need, right after oxygen, water is one of the most precious resources on the planet. Groundwater is stored far below the Earth's surface, in soils and rocks that are able to hold the water in the openings and cracks, like a sponge. From huge cities to tiny villages, about 50% of the world's population depends on groundwater every day. Just in the United States, groundwater makes up almost 40% of the water used for irrigation, bathing, and drinking. In Mexico City, one of the world's most populated cities, there is no nearby surface water. That means that 95% of the population relies on groundwater for all their water needs. And then, all the way across the Atlantic in Denmark, a staggering 99% of the drinking water for the entire country comes solely from groundwater. So, what's the problem? Well, while groundwater is the most abundant source of fresh water on Earth, it remains a hidden resource. We often know where to locate it, but what really keeps it hidden is the limited amount of data about its availability, current state, and use. In other words, we often have insufficient insight into the water below the ground. Let's look at an example. As our climate changes, droughts are happening more frequently. With a drought, there is less surface water, which leads communities to depend more and more on groundwater. But how can they know how to use it sustainably? Some communities may be polluting the groundwater reserves unknowingly through farming activities. A valuable resource could become seriously contaminated just because we can't see what effects our actions have below ground. This has consequences for everyone using the aquifer. Consider that every year, over 200 times more groundwater is extracted from the earth than oil. Since you can't manage what you don't measure, having reliable data is critical. Knowing what is going on below can even prevent conflicts in the long term. It's time to uncover the mysteries behind the great resource of groundwater. The key is informed action based on sound research. With proper groundwater management, we can make sure that our groundwater benefits many generations to come.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you, Anita. And let me now try to switch to my presentation. Let me see, that should be something like this. And voila. Do you see this?
That looks great.
Great. And you hear me. Okay. So groundwater, hey. To make groundwater visible, more visible, to make invisible visible. I found this idea of success stories great because we really need that in our quest to make groundwater more recognized and to get it higher the agenda and to pay more attention to this very valuable resource. Imagine there is no rain, or imagine there are no rivers and lakes, or imagine there are no seas and oceans. It's very difficult to imagine, huh? And now imagine there is no groundwater. What? Groundwater. Not everyone is really waking up with this thought and thinking how important it is for us. At the same time, as film showed, about 50% of population in the world drinks groundwater every day. And not only that, without groundwater, we would not have ecosystems, groundwater-dependent ecosystems. We would not have rivers because groundwater maintains the base flow of rivers and also prevents land subsidence and seawater intrusion. And in countries like the Netherlands, we know very well how important it is to have this balance. Climate change adaptation, putting more water underground and using it to bridge over dry periods. People do that already for 2,000 years in Yemen, in Iran, in Persia at that time. They started a long time ago. But as climate variation is increasing, we will need more that more and more. And also, groundwater is often a solution for people without access to safe groundwater. And there is 1 of 6 of us in this planet which still needs safe access to water. So, despite these impressive facts and figures, invisible groundwater is out of sight and out of mind for most of the people. At the same time, water scarcity affects a lot of people all over the world. It's increasing. And surface water, we see it is its availability is decreasing due to our activities and climate change. So we rely more and more on groundwater, but we are putting more and more pressure on groundwater. And so at the same time, we still don't manage our aquifers well enough. These are just some of the examples from India. This is South Africa, Cape Town, a couple of years ago. This is the US, and this is South Africa. Southern Africa, I must say, drylands and increase of population. So we really need to do more to build a case for invisible groundwater. Now, don't be scared. This looks complicated, but it's actually not. What we do is we monitor and assess groundwater in order to manage it sustainable according to sustainable goals of United Nations. And since groundwater is invisible, we need to do more on awareness, and this is one of the ways to do it. Diplomacy or lobbying, synergy, information and knowledge management, well, things which we are contributing to today. About groundwater monitoring and assessment, well, it's much more difficult to monitor groundwater than surface water because we need to most often to put a monitoring well and to go there to monitor or to have equipment to monitor. But it's necessary because we can't really assess something and we can't make any kind of prediction without analysis of historical data. So we can't manage what we don't measure, and monitoring is crucial. And then assessment, it's not only to assess underground, this matrix which is hosting groundwater, and also dynamics groundwater is moving. It's much more than that. We need to address environmental aspect, socio-economical aspect, legal, institutional, and especially in situations where we have internationally shared groundwaters, and most of the large aquifers, reserves of groundwater, substantial reserves, are international. And groundwater is stupid. It doesn't stop at the administrative borders. So it's very important to have multidisciplinary assessment, and then to start with the problem itself. So not to start and shout, okay, groundwater is important, so what? No, to see what the problem is and what is the role of groundwater in that topic and issue. So to embed groundwater in socio-economic environmental context. A couple of years ago, we did a survey among UN affiliated organizations, and even I was astonished when results of survey showed that more than 40 organizations deal with about 60 various topics containing groundwater. So that means groundwater is everywhere. And what we need to do, we need actually to get together and to merge these various attempts and activities and to raise our voice about the importance of groundwater. This inspired us to say, okay, we need a better provision on information on groundwater. So we will start with issues, as I just showed them, topics, environmental and societal. And then we will see what is the role of groundwater there, what kind of service groundwater provides. And then we can build up a catalog on groundwater management, tools, measures, and instruments. And that's what we are doing now. And that catalog should have exemplary cases. Wow, exemplary cases. So that means success stories. And this is something which I prepared right before our colleagues approached me and asked, could you say something in this webinar, success stories. So these success stories are very important because we learn from that. And it will be great to hear some of them today, but also to include them in this catalog, which will be Wikipedia-like, so everyone can add new success stories. Well, just to round off this introduction, next year will be a year of groundwater, where we will have a World Water Day dedicated on groundwater. We will also have a World Water Development Report on groundwater, which is called Groundwater Making Visible Visible. We will have this catalog as we are developing now, so you are very much welcome to join us in the development that one, and we will have a groundwater summit at the end of the next year. So next year is extremely important for groundwater, and I see these success stories as a very important contribution to year of 2022, a year of groundwater. So let's hear about success stories and let's contribute making groundwater more visible. Thank you.
Great, terrific. Thank you for that introduction and for some words of wisdom about some elements that are important for managing groundwater successfully, as well as information on upcoming resources that are going to be valuable to all of us and how we can contribute to them. Next, I'll turn the screen over to engineer Susan Kilani, who is going to talk to us about the Azraq Oasis.
You just want to, I think you're muted there. And if you could just make the screen full screen there, like we did before.
Where is it now?
Down at the bottom, I think.
Okay, is it now evident to you?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Looks
Okay.
great.
So we are talking about Azraq Oasis restoration project that we consider a success story in reviving back a very important site in Jordan that was a historical place and a Ramsar site. This is an old picture. It also includes me. This is in the 70s, early 70s, when the lakes were still present and where we had natural flow to the lakes, and we used to take boats even in those lakes in the past. I'd like also to quote a paragraph from Her Majesty's book, Queen Noor, on Leap of Faith. She was talking about the Eastern Badia and those lakes, that she said, lakes once covered the Eastern desert when fossilized lion teeth and elephant tusks can be found in the sand. On the road to Baghdad, there are the old 1,300-year-old Islamic desert castles with colorful frescoes and mosaic of bird, animals, and fruits, and heated indoor baths. It means that this area was full of civilization and had already the birds and animals and the wildlife that used to, of course, to follow the water availability. Not familiar with that. Okay. Okay. Also from aerial photographs, you can witness those wheels that are only visible from air. You cannot see them while you are in the ground. And again, some reports say that this is ancient civilization in the area where people used to live and have their grazing and cattle in the very ancient time. Coming to Azraq Basin in Jordan, this is located in the northern east part of the country and is of regional importance. It is shared between Syria and Jordan, but mostly it is found in Jordan. The total area is about 12,000 kilometers square. The characteristics of the Azraq Oasis, there's a drainage basin called Qa al-Azraq. It's full of mud flats and salt pans. And in that area, it's not easy to get recharged to the ground water from the, for example, from the floods and during the rainy season. It's almost sealed due to the presence of clay. The precipitation in the area ranges from 50 in the Azraq Oasis, 50 millimeter per year in the Azraq Oasis itself, to more than 1,000 millimeter per year in Jabal al-Arab. And Jabal al-Arab or Jabal al-Druz, which is in Syria, is the main recharge source to the Azraq Oasis and Azraq area. Mean daily temperatures in the winter is low as 10 degrees centigrade, but in the summer is very high as 45 centigrade. And that is why most of the water that is recharged sometimes into the dams, the desert dams, is evaporated and does not really find its way to the groundwater. So local recharge is minimal in the area. But it is lightly vegetated, although in some areas we have fruits, olive trees, and a range of vegetables are grown with irrigated agriculture. And that was the main reason for the mining of the aquifer and for the drying up of the Azraq oasis. We have three main aquifer systems in the area, but the main one is the upper one, which is the basalt before aquifer. The basalt formation is thick, closer to the Jabal al-Arab. It reaches a thickness of 1,500 meters, but thins gradually, and it is the main water source where we abstract the domestic water and agricultural also water, and also it used to feed the oasis with natural springs. Middle confined aquifer, it's called the B2A7 locally, and it is having saline water, and it is overlain by an aquitard. And the deeper one is a sandstone aquifer called locally is the Kurnob, and investigations showed that it has low yield and poor quality water. All the recharge comes towards the Azraq depression or towards the Azraq oasis, but mainly the recharge is coming from Jabal al-Arab, as we said, which is having high recharge and high precipitation rates. Local recharge is negligible, regardless of the many attempts to do harvesting and to catch the water and the flood water in desert dams. It is still negligible. The estimated total recharge is about 34 million cubic meter per annum. And the residence time was calculated by in our laboratory by carbon-14 and tritium. Tritium, of course, is negligible, but by carbon-14, it showed a residence time to the lakes at that time between 4,000 and 20,000 years old. We consider them fossil water. And I used to have samples to treat it as a black water for tritium measurements. So it is an Azraq Basin, and the Awsawil field, which was developed by the Water Authority of Jordan, is an important basin and water resource in the Jordan strategy. It provides the demand centers in the country by 15 to 20 MCM per annum of water. Farmers in the area are using more than 45 million cubic meter per annum. So total abstraction is 65 and the recharge is 34. So we are mining the aquifer, and that's why it has caused damage to the oasis in the past. Azraq oasis is designated as a Ramsar wetland of international importance and an important bird area by BirdLife International. It is an outstanding example of an oasis wetland in an arid region comprised of a large complex of spring-fed marshes and seasonally flooded mudflats. But the consequences of groundwater overpumping for domestic and agricultural uses have caused dramatic drawdown in the water table, in the groundwater aquifers, also salinization of some of the wells, because the saline front was emerging into the fresh water due to, of course, moving from steady state to transient state and overexploitation. Also, consequences on drying up of all the springs. So the discharge from the springs, we have northern part of the springs, or north part, which is Druze Springs, and the south part is the Shishan. Both of them dried off completely. The first group was in 87, and then the next group was in 92, and in December 92, the oasis dried up completely, and we had a dry area, marsh vegetation died off, slow burning fires began moving through the ground in areas that were formerly deep swamps, and many of the rare birds and plants disappeared totally. It became miserable, the area. And then the success story started by the restoration projects that was under the push of the Royal Society for Conservation of Nature. They managed in the 1994 to start with international support to restore a significant part of the wetland. Then in September 2020, also the habitat restoration efforts continued in the Azraq Reserve with the support from French Global Environmental Facility and the French Development Agency. By mid-December 2020, also the what we call Serhani fish returned back also to the wetland when it disappeared at a certain stage. The project goals were mainly to halt further degradation of the aquatic ecosystem in the oasis and to restore as much of the wetland as possible to a natural or near natural condition with a view to maintaining the biological diversity and also to establish integrated water resources management of the basin in the area. And the project activities were rehabilitation and management of the Azraq Wetland Reserve, establish EIA unit, Environmental Impact Assessment Unit within the Department of Environment, and improved implementation of the Ramsar Convention in Jordan, establish guidelines for agricultural development, develop water management plan for the basin, support long-term research on the conservation and management of water resources in arid and semi-arid regions. What are the achievements? Where large amounts of rubbish were cleaned and properly managed. In June 94, water was pumped back to the wetland from the basalt aquifer at a rate of 1.5 MCM per year, which is approximately 10% of the original input. At the same time, extensive rehabilitation and cleanup efforts to enhance the potential for recovery. Spring pools were dredged and enlarged, and many of the wadis leading to the reserve also were cleaned and deepened to enable the channeling of as much surface water runoff as possible during the rainy seasons. A new fence was erected to exclude also the site from grazing and exploitation of in the area, and construction of a new visitor center also in 97 as an educational, recreational, and scientific center. The ecological outcomes of that restoration project were that towards the end of October 94, the water table in the lakes began rising and parts of the oasis started to come back to life. Beginning of November, the rainy season of 94-95 was wet year. It yielded above an average precipitation and over 10 million cubic meters of water reached the wetlands. But during the following drought seasons, the wetlands remained in an environmentally and ecologically healthy state due to the rehabilitation efforts. So even it was resilient now to changes in the climate. And notable project achievements was that an adequate amount of water was secured and revived to rehabilitate Azraq wetland ecosystem and its biodiversity. Water quality also of Azraq Basin was enhanced, and the danger of complete salinization of the Azraq Basin has been lowered, and incremental minimization of pumping was attained. So the Water Authority of Jordan responded to the pressure of the environmental groups to bring down the pumping from around 20 MCM per year to 12. So that also helped to for the well-being of the whole ecosystem. Also, other success that was attained for the community itself, that they were now more involved and they were enabled. The local people, after lengthy periods of frustration, were empowered and began to participate in the overall socio-economic development of the area with the support of the Azraq Oasis Conservation Project. The Azraq Reserve is now a source of income to around 60 families from the local community, and there are increasing numbers of tourists visiting the area, and numerous companies have expressed interest in investing in the ecotourism. And a grassroots movement known as the Friends of Azraq Society was established to foster environmental preservation and the achievement of local socio-economic stability. What we are looking forward to in the future now to enhance more and improve tourism industry that is the main income to the Azraq community, improved agricultural productivity and use of technology, which is water efficiency versus productivity, improved sanitation services and utilization of the reclaimed water in agriculture in the area instead of the fresh water, aquifer water, better management of the water resources in an integrated manner to overcome impacts of overexploitation and reinforce local industries like the salt industry that historically was the main income for the Azraq community as an industry, enhance and finance local projects that engage the youth for a better livelihood of their communities. Now, the Azraq oasis looks like this now in the present time, and you can visit it and enjoy all the kind of birds and migratory birds and the wildlife again. And I thank you for your listening, and you may visit another links here for more information on the activities that are running in the Azraq oasis restoration. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you for that presentation. It was quite insightful. It's also amazing to see those photographs and very heartwarming to see the changes over time. I'm sure our participants have many questions for you, but before we get to them, I'm going to turn the screen over to Geert-Jan Nijsten.
Thank you, Anita. Let me just find the right screen to share.
That looks great.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to get rid of all of you. You're sitting on top of my own presentation. Yeah, that's it. We can skip the introductions. Thank you, Anita and Scott, for that. So I'm going straight into the nitty-gritties. I'm going to talk to you about some examples, successful examples of groundwater management in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is quite well known for its battle against water, and most people probably also know the little boy who stuck his finger in the dike to prevent flooding. Most people also know that it's a small country, but maybe many people don't realize how tiny a country it is. That's why you see here in blue the Netherlands, and I sort of projected it on top of India, and you can see that the Netherlands is about 75 times smaller than India, and it's about 10 times as small as California. But if we look at the population in those three parts of the world, then it's actually quite surprising that the Netherlands, the population density is very similar to that of India, which many people might not realize. And California, which is quite well known in the last years for its major problems, major issues on groundwater management and its droughts, as compared to the Netherlands, its benefit that there's a lot more land to maneuver with a much lower population density. So that's just setting the scene a little bit. Also in the announcement, it was said that many people will know the Netherlands for its water management, mainly keeping the sea and the rivers out. And you see here that actually in the Netherlands, it's not surprisingly the Netherlands is so well known for that, because in this graph from the OECD, OECD countries are compared by its water expenditure in relation to gross income, but also on the horizontal axis, expenditure per inhabitant. And there we see that the Netherlands has spends a lot of euros per inhabitant on water management. In total, more than $9 billion a year goes into water management in the Netherlands. I have to say that most of this money goes into managing the water safety of the Netherlands, so protection against flooding, but still a fair share also goes into groundwater management. So let's focus on the groundwater management. The Netherlands is positioned on the North Sea coast in a delta area of four major rivers. And very large parts of the country are below sea level. Most people know that as well. But here in the pinkish brown color, we see that actually 65% of the country would be at risk of flooding from high sea levels or high river levels if we wouldn't have any dunes to protect us from flooding from the sea, or maintain dikes along the rivers to protect us from flooding from the rivers. In this picture, you see a simplified cross-section of the hydrogeology of the Netherlands. Being a country in a delta area, in a subsiding basin, all of the Dutch aquifers, which we are currently using, are soft sediments, so unconsolidated sands, which actually act as one hydraulically connected aquifer system. So maybe in other parts of the world, this would be considered one aquifer, but in the Netherlands, we distinguish the different aquifer layers. General groundwater flow is from the southeast to the northwest, and the basin thickens towards in that same direction. You see here two different colors, and actually the sort of the orange-brown color depicts saline groundwater. So even though we have the luxury of having very high-yielding or generally high-yielding sandy aquifers, we have the issue, being a coastal country, that most of our groundwater is saline water and therefore not very suitable for use. The largest volumes of fresh water are found underneath the higher lying sandy areas in the central part of the Netherlands. And also, and we will talk more about that later, in the coastal zone under the dunes, where there's freshwater lenses. Here you see a generalized map of the direction of flow, with the higher groundwater tables found in the southwest of the country. And in green, areas depicted are the polder areas, which are very low-lying land, all below sea level, where also groundwater levels are below sea level. And I think something else which many people, even in the Netherlands, don't realize is that if we would stop the pumping in these low-lying areas, all these polders would simply slowly fill up with upwelling groundwater. So that also explains a bit why we need such high budgets to keep this country afloat, literally. When I talked about the cross-section, I already mentioned the occurrence of saline groundwater. Here you see a map showing the depth of the fresh groundwater, so the thickness of the freshwater lens, if you like. The areas are red are the areas where the volumes of freshwater are the largest. But you also see that large parts of this map are in white, and that means that saline groundwater is found at depth less than 100 meters. And some zones actually reaching to the surface. So that is very broad, so setting the scene for about the hydrogeology in the Netherlands. Then to give you a picture on the water usage in the Netherlands, on the right, you see a diagram showing the total water usage in the Netherlands, in this case for 2016. And where the thickness of the columns depicts also the volume of water being used. And we see on the right in the blue colors the use of fresh water. On the very right in dark blue, saline or brackish fresh water, surface water. In the middle, fresh surface water, and to the left in the green color is the use of groundwater. The amount of surface water being used is of course enormous in comparison to groundwater. But if you look at the bottom, most of this surface water, the vast majority, is used for cooling purposes. So for cooling in electric power plants and other large industrial use. And if we focus a little bit on the green groundwater column, then we see there, in the first red circle, that the Dutch water supply is actually depending on groundwater for about 62% of its sourced water. But also in agriculture, the circle at the bottom, combined use of groundwater for irrigation and groundwater for watering cattle also accounts to about 69% of total water use in agriculture. So when we look at the high value use of water, groundwater is actually very important in the Netherlands. Then zooming in a little bit more on the groundwater component on the left of your screen, we can see that from the total groundwater used per year, which is about 1.1 billion per year, we see that 3/4 of that groundwater is used for public water supply, roughly 10% by industry, 9% by agriculture, and the remainder is small use, private wells, and other purposes. So obviously, the importance and the relation between groundwater and water supply is a very strong one in the Netherlands. So having painted a picture of the setting we're talking about, now I'd like to share some of the successes with you. And yeah, painting a picture, even though it's a small country, it was actually quite challenging to just pick out a few storylines, because there is obviously a lot to tell. But I've done my best to pick out some of the interesting elements. I think one, and I'll be very curious to discuss maybe later some of the parallels with the developments in the oasis. But in the 1970s, we saw that in the Netherlands, but probably also in many other countries in the world, there was increased awareness on environmental impacts of human activity. And in the context of this webinar, there was also increased awareness on the negative impacts of using groundwater. And as one of the outcomes of that awareness, legislation around groundwater use was modernized, and the groundwater law was introduced, along with environmental law and planning laws. But here we're focusing on the groundwater law. And the groundwater law is a law which regulates the use of groundwater. So it's about quantitative groundwater management. Currently, the groundwater law is incorporated into the water law, but the essence of the legislation around groundwater hasn't changed. And the objective of this law was to protect the quantity of groundwater resources and to prevent negative impacts. And the most important instrument for this is licensing, which is a very clear way to regulate groundwater use. And another very important element was that the responsibility for this licensing isn't at the national level, but it was put at the regional level, at the provinces. And the provinces, being sort of a middle government, have the benefit of still being large enough to have specialized knowledge in-house, but being small enough that they're close enough to the actual water users, and they understand the dilemmas of these water users. And a very strong element of this groundwater law is the fact that these provinces are allowed to impose a tax on groundwater abstraction, and this tax is a dedicated tax that can only be used by the province on groundwater research or measures to prevent or mitigate negative impacts of groundwater groundwater abstraction. And this tax has a double benefit. It makes people aware of the price of water, groundwater in this case, but it also generates income for government to work on the management and protection of its resource. So now, can we actually see how we're talking about success stories? And paper is a very patient thing. So having a law is one, but does the law actually work? Here we see a graph of groundwater abstractions in one province. And we can see here that I already mentioned in 1981, the groundwater law was introduced. About 10 years later, there was also a very important policy on domestic and industrial water supply. And in this policy, two objectives were formulated. One was to really decrease industrial use of groundwater. And the second one was the goal to stabilize abstractions for water supply in the year 2000. And actually looking at this graph, you can see that both these policies were actually very successful. Looking at the orange in the graph, which is the use of groundwater for industry, there's a very steady decrease from, let's say, the mid-80s or mid or late 80s up to present day, where the use of groundwater for industry is really minimized. And we also see that the target was to have stabilization of the abstractions for water supply around the year 2000, but we actually see that the use, that's the big blue bars at the bottom, is already stabilizing in the 90s. And actually from around 2000, we see even a slight decrease in the water use, despite the fact that population has been growing and economic development in the country has also been growing. So the effect is, I think, mainly also by increased awareness on water efficiency and water savings measures through technology. Another sort of interesting detail to see, which it's hard to see from the actual picture, is that in 2009, many water-related laws were integrated into one new water law, and there was also a shift in responsibilities in terms of groundwater management. From part of the responsibility was shifted from provinces to water boards. And unfortunately, we see here that some of the data on smaller types of extraction disappear from the graph. And partly it is because the data might still be there, but it's much harder to get hold of them now because that responsibility has shifted to other organizations. But in practice, the situation is much worse, that this registration has really been hampered now by the shift in responsibility, because it turns out it takes quite a long time for institutions to build up enough capacity to actually take over these responsibilities. Then something else which is nice to highlight maybe from this graph is in the top of these sort of brown hashed bars, we see a new type of groundwater use occurring from, let's say, the mid-90s. And that is the use of groundwater for thermal energy storage, which is a new technology which is introduced to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So it's interesting to see also this connection between new technologies and competing use over water. Then moving on to the protection of groundwater quantity. Protection of groundwater in terms of quality is regulated under land use planning laws and environmental laws, so not under the groundwater law. And I don't have sufficient time to go into much detail during this webinar, but I just want to highlight two elements here. That on the left, you see a schematic drawing of the different groundwater protection zones in the Netherlands, which are based on a hydrological vulnerability assessment of each individual well field. And depending on the vulnerability of this well field, so whether the well field is protected by a clay layer above the well field, or whether it's a phreatic aquifer, which is at direct risk from pollution, depending on that setting, different regulations in terms of groundwater protection are in place. So this is a very nice combination, I think, between the science of hydrogeology and practical translation into regulation and legislation. On the right, we see an example of something which we call, it's tricky to translate sometimes, but drinking water protection files. And for each well field, all information is compiled, which is relevant in relation to the groundwater quality of that particular well field. Now, why I want to highlight this example of these drinking water protection files is that I believe it's a typical example of Dutch cooperation between stakeholders and different level of government, because it's not so much about the document of this file, but there's a whole process around it that all relevant governmental stakeholders, so from national government, provincial government, municipalities, water boards, and environmental agencies, come together at a regular basis to discuss this groundwater file and to take action accordingly, and to also monitor the actions they have taken. So I think the cooperative element is something to keep on to. Then moving on to more the technological successes. I already highlighted the importance of groundwater to the water supply in the Netherlands. We see here a map of the Netherlands with all sites from which water is taken for the production of drinking water. And in total, there's about 187 sites where groundwater is being extracted, 9 for surface water, 14 for riverbank infiltration, which is basically a combination between the use of groundwater and surface water, and 11 sites for large-scale artificial recharge. And that's something I want to zoom in a little bit on in the remaining minutes of this presentation. Because in combination of the more traditional groundwater abstraction through deep wells in the Netherlands, there's also already since very early days the use of managed aquifer recharge in the Netherlands. Looking a little bit at the history and every now and then zooming in on the water supply of Amsterdam, the capital of the Netherlands, is that if we look at the history, in around 1850, there was one of many huge cholera epidemics in Western Europe, but also in the Netherlands. And the population then was faced with the issue that surface water in many large cities, including Amsterdam, was heavily polluted. And people were looking for sources of good quality water. But as I highlighted already, in the western part of the country, there isn't much fresh groundwater. Most groundwater is saline. So for this reason, people started looking at using the water under the freshwater lenses in the dune area. So already in 1853, abstraction of this shallow groundwater from the dunes started, and through a pipeline was transported to Amsterdam to have the first public water supply in the Netherlands. In decades to come, many of the cities and towns in the coastal zone of the Netherlands followed suit and set up similar systems. Then interesting, already in 1905, an engineer who did some monitoring on groundwater levels realized that it's not only happiness. The water supply in these towns was good, but he noticed that groundwater levels were dropping. It took another 50 years before this became really apparent and seeped through policy and action. Also by that time, there were issues with salinization of the shallow groundwater. And then a pipeline was constructed from taking water from the River Rhine, about 60 kilometers southwest of this dune area, transporting this pre-treated water from the river into the dune area, infiltrating it there as a way to compensate the abstraction of groundwater so that the net groundwater use would decrease and the issues of salinization were halted. Then in later years, people realized that even though the water was pre-treated, there were still issues of eutrophication in the dunes, and that nature in these dune areas was suffering. So then the pre-treatment of the water was increased. So this is this sort of a shift in the thinking where we are considering also the environment. Then these systems were further expanded, with also in the 1980s, expanding the system by not only infiltrating water from the surface, but also by using aquifer storage and recovery, so using deep wells for infiltration. And in the 1990s, some of the wells which were not compensated by infiltration of water were reduced or completely stopped in order to restore the wet ecosystems of the dune areas. And this whole system of using surface water, infiltrating it in the dune areas and abstracting it again and transporting it to the cities and towns around the coast, that whole system is still active 150 years ago, later, with some innovative, oh, sorry, I can't get this thing off now. With some new innovative measures to increase total water availability. And that's the last example I want to show with you. This concept of COSTA, which we call COSTA, which is a specific form of managed aquifer recharge in coastal zone. And in these technologies, what we try to do is by combining the use of brackish water and infiltrating fresh water. On one hand, we enlarge the total volume of water which becomes available for water supply by also using brackish groundwater. But by abstracting brackish groundwater from the system, you create more space for fresh water to be infiltrated. And these are concepts which we are piloting now in the Netherlands at various locations. On the lower left in the blue is a pilot which is run by Dunea, which is one of the water supply companies along the coast in the south. But this same technology is also applied now in another part of the country where there's many huge agriculture in greenhouses, where they have issues with flooding and in some parts of the year and shortage of water in other times of the year, and even a pilot in Chile, where there's a huge difference between the seasons with years early in spring, heavy floodwaters because of snow melt, but in summer, a lack of water and a lack of surface water. So by using floodwater and storing it underground, we create this better balance in available water year round. So with this, I've given you some examples of the success of, I think, on the successful impacts of water legislation in combination with technological developments. Of course, there are still many challenges for the future as development and population expands in the lands. And on a day-to-day basis, we're still dealing with this competition between different land use in the Netherlands over the still, even though compared to some other countries, abundant resource, but for each water sector, still a scarce resource. So thank you for your attention.
Great, terrific. Well, thank you for a very fascinating and comprehensive presentation. It helps us to have a better understanding of all of the many efforts being undertaken in the Netherlands. So now we're going to turn to our Q&A session. There are a number of questions that you have all put in the Q&A box on the chat. I'm going to start with a question of my own for the panelists, and then I'll be selecting from that. Some of those questions that you've been putting in are very specific to each of the case studies, and I'm going to remind the speakers that they are welcome to respond to those through typing into them, because we're going to have insufficient time to get to all of them. But everybody here is quite friendly and welcome. So if you have further follow-up questions, feel free to follow up with our speakers or to send us questions, and we can maybe help put you in touch with them. So to begin and open up our Q&A, just looking across all three presentations, there's a number of complexity there. And I can see within them that successes there were not the result of a single effort, but rather there's a cumulative effect of a constellation of actions that have helped to bring about the positive increases in management and success within both of the two case studies. So Gert-Jan and Susan, I'm wondering, what do you see as the key points of leverage that made this progress possible? What do you think led to the action on the ground?
I think it was the awareness of the environmental groups in Jordan and their pressure over the Water Authority of Jordan to stop overexploitation or to reduce it. We are still mining the aquifer, and I have many of the questions asking, how do you manage that 65 MCM is extracted and you have 34 only recharged, and how do you manage? It was under the pressure of the environmental groups and their awareness that we could really attain some of the success. I don't say that we achieved full success, because we are still also mining the aquifer up till this moment. With the increasing of population also, we are having more demand, and people in the Water Authority of Jordan tend to go to the aquifers and exploit more and more. So the success was mainly having strong environmental group, maybe supported also by the court in Jordan, the royal court, and some members of the royal court. They also were keen to preserve that area and to make some pressure on the water users also to reduce their abstraction. But still we need so much to do. We need really to work towards also the agricultural groups and all of those illegal wells that are drilled and not regulated yet. So we have influential groups in Jordan that sometimes do not obey the laws, and they just escape the punishment. And that here in that area, we need real work and real national efforts from everybody, besides, of course, the environmental groups that are present.
Jen, do you find a similar set of pressures from interest groups that are key towards the successes in the Netherlands, or do you think there were other factors that were essential?
I think there's definitely some similarities. I think the awareness on environmental issues, and I think also even the time that the time when this happened, I think coincides quite nicely. So that's definitely a similarity. Also, the influence, the power of law is definitely a similarity. With, I think, the benefit in the Netherlands that it's harder in the Netherlands to get beyond the law. So even though, of course, we have powerful groups, and agriculture is very powerful in influencing policy making and the law, but that's like I say, they're powerful in influencing policies, but they don't go beyond the law. So that's, I think, a difference in the Netherlands. It's in terms of other key factors of success, I think it's a little bit hard because I try to paint a really broad picture of developments in the Netherlands. But if you look, for example, at let's call the last example, the success story of using dune water, I think the first trigger was an externality, this epidemic and polluted surface water. But then to get out of that, I think it was a combination of innovation and cooperation. Because, for example, the idea was there, but in the Netherlands at the time in 1850, they couldn't get enough money together. So actually this whole initiative was funded with money from England, which is quite extraordinary. Somebody saw money in it. But that means that an engineer was also going beyond only the pure technical, but had ways to promote this idea, to advertise this idea. So this combination of innovation and going beyond your own field, I think that is a key factor, I think, of many of the stories in the Netherlands.
Now, both of you mentioned awareness as being part of that. And one of the first questions that popped into our Q&A was partly related to questions about knowing and having a knowledge and monitoring groundwater. So actually, this is a question for all three of you. Do we have to wait for full knowledge before acting? But I think we could ask even more broadly, what was the role of knowledge and monitoring and information in both of those case studies? And then Nino, if you can talk about where you have seen knowledge as being particularly important or where you've seen progress even in the absence of knowledge. So this is a question for all three of you. Whenever
it is, if I may, it is what Gert-Jan just mentioned, incentive. People need incentive to do something, to take an action. And well, it's, some people incentive is earning money. Nothing wrong with that. If you can direct that in improving groundwater situation. But the problem with the groundwater is again being invisible. And if there is, if you look at if I look at the channel through my window, or you look at the river, then if level is dropping, or if water is changing the color, it's relatively easy. You have evidence to alarm people and to do something. But with groundwater, it's really difficult because you can't see it without a proper monitoring, and then groundwater is moving slowly. So then it can take sometimes years before you realize, oops, we have a large pollution. So, I think that, again, success stories are very important, but at the same time, we need to be critical. Even in a success story called Netherlands, about use of groundwater by agriculture, about microplastics and the other things. So it should be right message together. Thank you. Balanced.
Great. Here, Jen and Susan, how was knowledge, either very scientific or more general awareness, essential for both of your example?
Yeah, of course, knowledge is important, and knowing your aquifer and your system and the even socioeconomic condition is vital for management of the whole system. So for example, for the water monitoring was crucial because you need to know what is your baseline in the steady state condition, what will happen in transient conditions, about the also saline front when it is critical, abstraction rate that will introduce the saline water into the freshwater bodies. For example, where are the locations? We had even made many coring. It was a project that I was involved in, where we made cores in different parts to understand why there is the phenomena in certain areas, not in other areas, and what are the root cause and the evolution of salinity in that area, for example. Coming also to the wetland and the measurement of flows, the total water balance, inflows, abstraction, also trying to go to farms and really find numbers for abstraction from licensed farmers, of course, is very important to manage. Also, you can make, let's say, meetings with the social community and understand their problems. We had made many sessions with them, both awareness and also trying to capture their concerns at what things can we do for their livelihood to maintain it. So you need that. You need the information for better management of all the aspects of the area and the environment concerning the water demand, and also the environmental share of water also to that area, the right for the environment.
Jan, you want to talk about the role of knowledge or action without knowledge in the Netherlands?
Yeah, I think maybe first start on the role of sort of action without knowledge. When I talked about again about the system of using the dune water, this was triggered by a disaster, a cholera epidemic, and that's something we've also seen. I don't know how the phrase is said exactly, but let's say never waste a good disaster, because new things come from that. My example was one, but there's a very important example in Dutch sort of surface water management, river basin management, that in the late 90s we had 2 years where there was really severe risk of flooding in the Netherlands. Thousands and thousands of people were evacuated from their homes, but this gave a real impetus and new momentum to the water management in the Netherlands. All of a sudden, additional funds were released, but also with these additional funds, a lot of new ideas and new knowledge was generated. So that's not that there weren't any data, but that can be a very important trigger. But it goes without saying, and I think it's also clear from all three examples, that in the end, to take effective measures, you cannot deal without data or information. I showed in the very brief example about the groundwater protection measures, how you have this combination between the science of hydrogeology to work out what the vulnerability of a particular well field is, and to use that information in your land use planning regulations and your environmental policies. So there is this very strong link between data and the knowledge of your system and even other fields which are not directly related to groundwater. And I think it was also shown in the example of the dune system, where already after, it took about 30 years before somebody started actually taking some measurements on groundwater and started realizing the negative impacts of this system. And then it took another 40 years before that was really translated into action. So it is a very important element, but on its own, it's not necessarily powerful enough.
So we have another question. This is based on a question by Thomas Milman in the chat, where Thomas is asking really about what is needed to establish proper arrangements for integrated water resources management. But I think this question stems from the fact that in both of these case studies, you're looking at the conjunctive use of both surface and groundwaters in order to address the groundwater problem, as well as the fact that there are a number of institutions that had to be involved and coordinate in this process. So I'm wondering if you could talk to what were some of the key elements that led to the ability to both manage surface and groundwaters together, as well as to work across institutions within both of the case studies.
Yeah, I can start off on that. I didn't mention it in the presentation, but I mentioned the boy in the dike. But another sort of champion fact of the Netherlands is that it's claimed, at least in Western Europe, sort of one of the oldest still existing democratic bodies are the Dutch water boards, which originated already around 1200 or 1400. So this whole institutionalized water management is a very old thing in the Netherlands, which obviously really helps when dealing with water-related issues. But on top of that, there is also a very strong culture of cooperation between government at different levels and between government and non-governmental stakeholders. And I strongly believe that that is an important element in these success stories in the Netherlands. And that was also the reason why I highlighted this example of these groundwater protection files, which on paper seems it's just another report describing the situation around the well. But the fact that this information is compiled between all relevant parties and they make together a plan on which actions and measures to undertake, and they monitor together to what extent these plans are actually implemented, I think that's a very powerful way of working.
How about in the Jordan case study? But you're on mute.
To answer your question, I think I will move away from Azraq and look at the national approach. Of course, the Water Authority of Jordan has developed its strategy and its related policies, which deals with the groundwater abstraction and management in integrated manner, looking at the surface water utilization in view of the climate change now, and that we are having different patterns of precipitation, more utilization of the reused water. That's why also we need to replace the fresh water that is used for agriculture by reclaimed water that is meeting the standard, to try to liberate more of the fresh water for other purposes. Because in Jordan, for example, agriculture is consuming more than 50% officially of water resources, but actually it is more than 70%. So if you save from agricultural water used, you can save the other sectors in demand. Besides the policies, also we have along the supply chain, the whole supply chain, also many key players and beneficiaries that are integrated within the roles, and the roles are specified within their own laws and regulations. So, for example, in the catchment areas, you have to involve environmental groups, agricultural groups, or the stakeholders that are in the catchment, together, of course, with the water authority that is will utilize the water for different purposes. And along also the chain, you have to encounter the players according to the need. For example, when you come to preparing drinking water, you will involve the Ministry of Health and so on. So we have all the set of regulations that support the integrated management of all the water resources, having also the utilization of both surface and groundwater. And in our policy, we are trying as much as we can to rely more on surface water now, and to try to release the pressure on the groundwater, because we have exhausted all the groundwater resources in the country. We are like exploiting more than 200% of the safe yield of the groundwater. And that is really going to damage, or we are saying in our words, we are drying up our aquifers. That will be very unsustainable. We will not leave anything for the future generation, and we have to act now. And I think it is a serious attempt now to address all that in a comprehensive manner in the country with all the stakeholders. I don't know if I'm replying that, but again, still, I feel that we do not put the environmental rights also of water in our plans. And still we are exhausting the environmental share of water. And that's why the springs are drying up, aquifers are drained, and the corresponding ecological life is threatened. So there must be, again, the balance between what we need from the water under the demand, severe demand conditions and severity and scarcity of water, and again, to look at the environmental rights for water.
And I believe, Susan, this is also a shared challenge, that even though, of course, the setting is different, and both in terms of hydrogeology and socio-political environment, but this fact that in the end, the voice of the environment is a weak one. And Neno already mentioned as well, economic pressures are also important, and that's also, I didn't have time anymore to talk a little bit about the future challenges in the Netherlands, but one of the largest challenges we see also in the Netherlands is this competing use between agriculture and groundwater for groundwater dependent ecosystems. And in the Netherlands, it might not be a case where we have a lowering of the groundwater table of tenths of meters of the surface, because we have so much replenishment. But those ecosystems, they depend on these very small changes in groundwater level and groundwater quality. So even though on the map the changes might seem insignificant to people from outside the Netherlands, the ecosystem itself thinks differently about it, and that's still the big challenge, to manage that properly.
Great, thank you. We have a number of other questions in the chat, and we are not going to be able to get to all of them. So as a reminder, we're going to put the presentations on the internet. I want to just take one last second to reflect on the fact that these are two countries with very, very different social histories, political histories in relation to water use, as well as environmental and geological conditions. And yet there were some similarities across both of these, related to awareness, related to the role of pressures and the environment in creating change, and related to the ways in which they implemented multiple efforts at once that were seeking both to restrict groundwater abstractions as well as transform technologies and change the ways in which the water was applied to lead to some successes. So we will try to find ways to have people answer the remainder of your questions in relation to these two. And we're going to come back to you with some additional examples over the course of the next few months. So please do stay tuned. We will have our webinar number 2 in late August, where we're going to be honing in on more narrow types of successes. Likely this one will be focused on policy and implementation successes. And if you have any additional suggestions about things that you think we should be highlighting and broadcasting awareness with, please do send those to us. I also want to let you know that the Groundwater Task Force is involved in a number of other activities, some of which are related to other webinar series, some of which are reports and conferences and other organizing where we get professionals in this realm together. And we're also going to be creating some awareness activities and outreach events. So if anybody's interested in participating, please do email the IWRA executive office or myself. My email is here. And with that, I will turn the screen back over to Scott.
Well, thank you so much for your great job moderating today. We can go ahead and leave that slide up there so everyone can kind of think about it and be inspired. We're looking forward to hearing from you. And how should they contact you, Anita, if they want to participate?
My email here is at the bottom of the screen.
Sorry, I didn't see it. Okay, great. Well, then contact Anita and be a participant in our next event. And we'd love to have you join the IWRA and join the Groundwater Task Force. So I'd like to again thank the panel so much for joining us here today. So a big thank you to Nino Kukurić, Director of the UNESCO International Groundwater Resources Assessment Center in the Netherlands, Susan Kalani, Water Quality Management Specialist and Trainer in Jordan, Gert-Jan Niesen, Senior Advisor for Delaware Institute for Applied Research on the Water in the Netherlands, and our great moderator, Anita Milman, a professor at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst in the United States. So as Anita mentioned, all the panels presentations will be put online, so you can download the PowerPoint presentations again, or you can watch the video again. And please feel free to reach out to any of our panelists if your questions were not answered, or if you have other questions. As I wrote, they're all really friendly, extremely personable. So I'm sure they'd be very happy to hear from you and to engage with your questions. So I know that some of the panel on the IWRA are also on Twitter. So if you want to, and you're on the social media, please look them up and give them a follow. And if the presentations left you interested in learning more, you can check out our LinkedIn webpage and continue the discussion. Follow us there for more IWRA updates. So I'm hoping that all the insights provided by our panel here in this special event were helpful to you and give you something to engage with. It gave me a lot of material to think about. So I'm hoping this is going to generate some creativity for you and really bring you back to wanting to see our second event, Janita said, is getting planned for in a few months. So I just want to remind everyone in the panel here, or in the audience, that the webinar is brought to you by the International Water Resources Association. This is our 50th anniversary, so we've been around for a half century, and in that time, as a nonprofit, non-governmental educational organization, we've really been able to engage with people around the world, such as yourselves, and to bridge the disciplines, the geographies, and connected everybody, professionals. We've had students, individuals, corporations, institutions, everyone who's able to focus on the sustainable use of the world's water resources. So if you're interested in learning more about the association or becoming a member of the association or the task force, please go to www.iwra.org. So on behalf of the whole IWRA office, thank you so much for coming today and viewing our webinar. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.